We just got some incredibly exciting news regarding Part 3 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. It's starting to look like this game is going to release a lot sooner than maybe any of us have expected. If you remember back to earlier this year, after we got the release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, we got word that Part 3 was essentially on the same track development-wise as Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was after Final Fantasy VII Remake. It was about 3.5 to 4 years of development time in between Part 1 and Part 2, and so far we've heard that it was about the same development time between Part 2 and Part 3. In fact, aside from the news of the development length of Part 3, Tetsuya Nomura may have even hinted that they were going to start recording voice lines for the main story of the game. And no matter where a game is being developed in the world, typically, if you know anything about game development, recording lines for the game is one of the last steps of creating the game. It was actually from this tweet from Audrey on X or Twitter, who actually said, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 main story has already been completed, and Nomura thinks that they will perhaps start voice recording in the near future. This tweet, though, has since been deleted, so as far as its validity, I'm not totally sure. But we have recently gotten some very interesting details about the development of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. In a recent interview with the Daily Star, Naoki Hamaguchi actually gave some more insight into what he would do differently with Part 3. In this particular interview, he's discussing the minigames and the trophy hunt in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. He goes into how many players felt that the game felt a little over-bloated with the amount of minigames in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, as well as just the difficulty of obtaining the Platinum Trophy. He talks about how, in his opinion, the development team actually went the correct direction in including all of that content. However, he does also note that if you were to ask him if they would do the same amount of minigames in Part 3 as they did in Part 2, he says that he doesn't think that they will. He also says that he does kind of regret making the Platinum Trophy so difficult to obtain, so for Part 3, it's not going to be nearly as much of a grind as Part 2 was. So from that interview alone, we can already see kind of what they're thinking in regards to cutting back some content, maybe in the realm of minigames, to make the development time a little bit quicker, as well as making it a bit more enjoyable and having less, I guess, controversial elements of the game, because he goes, you know, into talking about how some people loved the minigames, some people hated a lot of the minigames. If you cut back some of that, you're going to have less discourse in general regarding the minigames. And then obviously the Platinum Trophy for Part 3 will be a lot more manageable to obtain. So for a lot of trophy hunters out there, that's probably a huge plus. So like I said, cutting down some of that content is probably going to make the development time a lot quicker, especially since you've already created all of these assets. And maybe if the other thing is true about recording voice lines here pretty soon, it's looking like this game is going to be a much more seamless development than Part 2 was. But in another topic regarding DLC for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Hamaguchi had some other very interesting things to say, mainly in that we're not getting any DLC for Part 2. If you remember back for Final Fantasy VII Remake, and whenever it got ported over to the PlayStation 5 with all those other enhancements, we got the Yuffie DLC, where it kind of gave us a little bit of more Final Fantasy VII content to hold us over until Rebirth, as well as introducing new mechanics to the gameplay, showing us how Yuffie is going to work in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. But he says they're not doing any of that specifically for the purposes of working solely on Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 and not wasting any extra time on DLC. So in the time between Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, they spent all that time creating brand new assets and maps and characters and gameplay systems for Final Fantasy Rebirth, and it's looking like that is all paying off for Part 3 greatly. We're not getting any DLC for Final Fantasy Rebirth, which, even though that may sound like a bummer to a lot of people, it really is only sounding like, to me, that this just means we are getting Final Fantasy Remake Part 3 a lot sooner than we expected. And one of the things about all those mini-games was just how varied a lot of them were in their gameplay. Obviously, if you're making a lot of gameplay mechanics, that's going to take a lot of time. So if we cut back that development time of trying to create new systems for players to play around with, that is greatly going to cut back development time. So what do you guys all make of this? What do y'all think about cutting back some of the mini games in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3? What do you think about there being no DLC for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? I, for one, just think that all of this is a plus. I personally felt that, yeah, I was getting a little exhausted with all of those mini games from Rebirth. So to hear that they're going to kind of tighten that up a little bit, have some mini games still. There's still going to be plenty of mini games, it sounds, to be in part 3, but just not as over bloated as Rebirth was for a lot of people. But who knows, maybe I'm just coping with this, but do y'all think that we could actually get a release of late 2026 for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? Definitely fingers crossed. I don't know if we can actually get there, but hey, we're cutting back DLC, we're cutting back side content for part 3. Let's just hope that whenever it does come out, we are still getting a high quality experience. I'm sure we will. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was a fantastic gaming experience. So anyways, if y'all liked this video, go ahead and hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell as well so that you're notified whenever new videos like this go up. Anyways, my name is Gavin, and I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.